Hi, the title of my presentation is Jesus and Revolution, Leading a Change Movement and Reinvesting the Public Space. My paper is going to combine three angles. The first is an analytical reflection on the change movement in Lebanon of the 17 October 2019. The second angle will explore Jesus's ministry as a change movement through an exegesis of specific passages in the Gospel of John. And the third angle will derive principles for the consolidation and pursuit of change in Lebanon from the biblical exegesis. First, let's look at the Arab Spring and its relationship with the change movement in Lebanon. The Arab Spring was an anti-authoritarian manifest in revolt against dictators. It also, however, was a revolt against religious authorities that controlled public life. Secondly, the Arab Spring was a rejection of religious extremism in all of its forms. And thirdly, we can describe it as a pro-democratic movement of social liberation with electoral reforms as a central demand. This is according to the typologies of contemporary social movements framework that Gregory Leffel speaks about in his book, Faith-Seeking Action. When we look at the change movement in Lebanon, we see that it is effectively a continuation of the Arab Spring in spirit, but the enemy is very different in nature. The enemy is anti-sectarianism, where political sectarianism is identified as the main enemy. The true anti-sectarian spirit of the uprising, however, lasted no more than 3 months. Beyond that, segments of the movement were captured by various sectarian leaders, which we call Za'im, and it became decentralized and sectarian once again. The Za'im is a local socio-political leader with tremendous influence over his popular base. Through a deeply rooted patronage system, the Za'im, along with his family, has provided services and developed clientelist relations with members of his sect for decades, sometimes even centuries. Most Lebanese Za'im, or Zu'ama in the plural, were involved as warlords during Lebanon's civil war with total impunity. But the core of the change movement lived on and transformed into organized and emerging political parties. And what we saw was the emergence of coalitions and larger groupings of smaller groups. This led to elections on the 15th of May of 2022, whose results surprised everyone. 13 new MPs of the change movement made it into parliament. Let's look at the gospel as from a political theology perspective. Christopher Rowland says, the effect of the life of Jesus as remembered and told by the first Christians is thoroughly political. What lessons then can we draw from that movement to challenge an unjust political status quo and restore justice in our nation? How do we develop a good political theology that transforms our nation by doing justice to the poor and bringing out the marginalized into the mainstream? Not a utilitarian politic that continues to serve the dominant elite, but one that advances the values of the gospel. Jürgen Moltmann, in speaking about the cross, says, the cross is our political critique. The cross is our hope for a politics of freedom. The memory of the crucified Christ is our reason for political theology. The cross then reorders the dynamics of power in society, and it keeps in check our own unhealthy thirst for power. Can the cross, as a self-giving act, become the framework for our political theology in Lebanon? We're going to explore Jesus' change movement in this next section. We're going to explore a sample of prophetic signs and prophetic acts performed by Jesus in the Gospel of John in search for such a framework. As we know, the Gospels are not to be read as simple biographies or as descriptions of chronological events that occurred in the life of Jesus, in the life of his disciples, the crowds, and the religious and political powers of the time. The Gospels are much more than that. Graham Stanton insists that the evangelists have two concerns: to tell the story of Jesus as they understand it, and to spell out their convictions concerning the continuing significance of Jesus after Easter. Story and significance are intertwined and sometimes tangled. What we're interested in from this reflection on Johannine passages are narratives as lessons with political significance. It is my belief that the Gospel of John represented a formidable challenge to the dominating religious and political powers of the day, and that it still does so today. As it did for the early followers of Jesus, what significance does this movement hold for us? Which characters in the Gospels are we? What do we learn from their attitudes and position? What do such narratives tell us about how we should behave? And in what ways are we called to follow Jesus in challenging the dominating religious and political powers of our day? We will explore briefly two handfuls of key passages through the Gospel of John, along what I believe to have been a carefully crafted political manifesto for the early church, as for us today. Our brief survey of Johannine passages will reflect first on the 7 signs of Jesus, and second on 5 prophetic acts which he performed, apparently to infuriate the dominant powers of the day. In doing so, we will note the relevance of these passages to a political theology for Lebanon today. So first, the 7 signs of power, transitioning from the old to the new. The first sign that Jesus performed was in the small town of Cana in Galilee. It speaks of the importance of timing. The timing of change is crucial. The first sign occurs on the 3rd day, verse 1 tells us. The old has expired or run out, or it does not fit the need anymore. At any rate, the old system has gone bankrupt. The need for the new is recognized and announced, initially by lone voices whom the old has not benefited. This voice of faith here is represented in Jesus' mother, who becomes the source of the subversiveness. The instruments of change are simple. They are local and casual. There is no external import or magical formula. The 6 purification jars are there. They're not made of gold, but of stone. They're large and can hold a large amount of the new. The water is available. It's not holy water, but simply water used for the washing of feet for purification, as we read in verse 6. The servants are in waiting, ready for the command. The prophetic act can take place as soon as the word of authority is spoken, and it is spoken in verses 7 to 8. The master of ceremony is surprised. He has been presiding over such ceremonies and serving in public life for years. Never has a bridegroom saved the best wine for last. The new is not only new in itself, but even the mode and timing of its entrance are new and unexpected. They take by surprise those who will benefit from it. John informs us of 2 further lessons in this passage. The signs are performed to reveal Jesus' glory, and his disciples believe in him as a result, as we read at the end of the passage in verse 11. The second sign is the healing of the son of a royal official in chapter 4. When the adherents to the old system adopt a cavalier attitude toward the new, attention is turned to those outside the fold. Rarely are members of the old system able to recognize the new when it arrives. They're too engrossed in their own benefits and refuse to give them up. Every reformer in history has had to reckon with this reality, and most have had to look outside the fold for supporters. The prophetic vision is not given to everyone. As a result, a change leader pays greater attention to those outside the mainstream to broaden their pool of adherents. The second sign occurs on the 3rd day as well, and again in the town of Cana. It follows the encounter of Jesus with the Samaritan woman in the previous chapter, and the ensuing profession of faith in Jesus by a host of Samaritans from her village. As in the first sign in Cana, it was a woman, then Mary in chapter 2, now a Samaritan in chapter 4, who manifests the prophetic attitude of faith. The detail provided by John that the royal official's son lay sick at Capernaum parallels the centurion's servant who was suffering terribly, as we read in Matthew 8, verses 5 to 6, and who, quote, was sick and about to die in Luke 7, 1-2, whom Jesus encountered after he entered Capernaum as well. John most likely is hinting to his readers that the main actor in this narrative, the certain royal official, as he calls him, was in fact a Gentile. As in the first sign that resulted in the belief of Jesus' disciples, the main result of the second sign in verse 54 is the belief of the royal official's entire household. We read in verse 53, so he and his whole household believed. Meeting people's immediate needs driven by compassion remains a central function of a leader. But whereas the Galileans assumed that they owned Jesus and that he owed them such services because, as a Jew, he was one of them, the Gentile royal official received the healing as a gift, not one taken for granted, and he led his entire family to become adherents to the new movement. The third sign we want to look briefly at is the healing of the paralytic at the pool of Bethesda in chapter 5 of John's Gospel. In addition to the appeal that change holds to those outside the religious mainstream, it also holds phenomenal appeal to the socially marginalized. Whereas traditional leaders use the sacred symbols of religions, such as temple, Sabbath, cross, hijab, etc., and nation states, such as borders, passports, exclusive citizen rights, to consolidate the boundaries of their power, leaders of change challenge the sacred symbols of the old system that has replaced justice and human compassion with rigid tradition. Jesus challenges the status quo in the life of the marginalized. He offers the possibility of a new and different future. The marginalized are drawn out of victimhood as soon as a word of faith and prophecy helps them reframe assumptions about an impossible future. Get up, pick up your mat, and walk, in verse 8. The empowered marginalized become living proof of new possibilities, liberated from the chains of the traditions that once bound them. They are empowered to rebuff the lame sacralized arguments of the religious leaders about the unlawful carrying of a mat on a Sabbath day. The previously marginalized acquire subversive confidence. They develop a prophetic voice that challenges the status quo. In verses 12-15, we read, the man went away and told the Jewish leaders that it was Jesus who had made him well. This is the man's courageous public proclamation of faith before the leaders of his religion as soon as he found out the truth about the author of his new healed condition. As leaders of change challenge the old systems and structures, they draw upon themselves, however, the fury of the dominant powers who begin to persecute them, as we read in verse 16. And as compassionate leadership raises the leader of change to moral high ground, it also exposes them to mortal danger. After affirming that he had performed this miracle in imitation of God, his Father, Jesus' path to the cross becomes assured. We read in verse 17, for this reason they tried all the more to kill him. Not only was he breaking the Sabbath, but he was even calling God his own Father, making himself equal with God. The fourth sign is the feeding of the crowds in chapter 6. Corruption, clientelism, and the culture of impunity together lead to the breakdown of entire social, political, and economic systems. As in the time of Jesus, so in Lebanon today. On August the 4th of 2020, the disintegration of the Lebanese state was phenomenally manifested in the Beirut port explosion, the peak of a long history of impunity and intrinsic violence. Lebanon's economic collapse has left in its trail terrible consequences. Poverty has hit a large proportion of the Lebanese population, with living conditions reaching an all-time low. At the time of Jesus, the Gospels recount stories reflecting all these ills. We read about Zacchaeus' repentance over his corrupt financial practices in Luke 19, about the clientelism of Matthew, the Jewish tax collector called to become a disciple after working for the Roman authorities in Matthew 9, and of the impunity of the culture where the criminal Barabbas is freed in exchange for the execution of the righteous Jesus in Mark 15 and parallels. The social, political, and economic systems were clearly not working for the best interest of the majority of the Jewish population of first century Palestine. In such a context, the gospel accounts of the feeding of crowds are particularly significant. A change movement has to make use of the meager resources available. The account in John chapter 6 shows how care for the hungry out of the little available transforms them from skeptics to believers in new possibilities. It reframes erroneous popular notions of economics and wealth. Jesus is moved to compassion by the needs and despair of his people, and he chooses to take action. His act will be economic in nature. Leaders of change challenge the mentality of scarcity by sensitizing followers to the needs of the poor and to their responsibility toward them. Two opposite attitudes emerge in this story. Philip exhibits the familiar fear of economic conservatism. It would take more than half a year's wages, literally in Greek, 200 denarii, to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite, he says in verse 7. Sharing is not economically wise policy. The poor might become dependent on us. Why did they not think to bring their own food when they knew they were traveling so far from home? If we dip into our reserves now, what will we do if we hit an economic downturn? The tentative voice of faith, on the other hand, this time comes from Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, another disciple. He speaks up with a more liberal, yet still somewhat skeptical economic mindset. Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish. He adds, but how far will they go among so many? In verses 8 and 9. Andrew believes that with Jesus among them, sharing will not lead them to economic hardship. He's ready to share, but he remains a realist. The mentality of affluence and sufficiency may be triggered by our confidence that Jesus is among us, but without supernatural faith, it only takes us so far. It is now for Jesus to demonstrate what may result when minds and hearts practice gratitude and are willing to share from available resources. Jesus, in verse 11, distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. As much as they wanted, we read, there are no austerity measures in Jesus' economics. When just economics are practiced, the change movement gains people's trust, and more adherents come to believe in the possibility of a new reality to replace the old. In verse 14, we read, after the people saw the signs Jesus performed, they began to say, surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. The 5th sign in John 6, from verse 16, is the walking on water. A change movement is bound to go through tempestuous times. The path to change is paved with both highs and lows. The experience of plenty guarantees neither continued affluence nor the permanent alleviation of both physical and emotional disorientation. And it is telling that this passage or this sign follows immediately the sign of the feeding of the crowd. But leaders of change know how to navigate such waters. They are able to communicate peace and alleviate fears among movement adherents, and they know how to lead them safely to shore. The 6th sign is the healing of the blind. And I won't spend too much time on this because it's such a rich passage, but you'll be able to read it in the paper. Leaders of change here know how to inspire with a powerful vision that cultivates confidence and fosters the emergence of new ambassadors for the cause. And finally, the 7th sign in John 11 is the raising of Lazarus from the dead. Sustained moral leadership cultivates an irresistible culture of life that threatens all the pillars of the dominant culture of death. As we know, John 11 is an extremely rich chapter. And so again, I will not dwell on it for too long. But what we see is that from this point on, moral change leaders must be prepared to lay down their life for the cause, as all the foundations of the previously dominant culture threaten to collapse, creating an unsustainable reality for the dominant order. In addition to the 7 signs that I quickly reflected on from John's Gospel, I also want to quickly survey 5 prophetic acts. I call them prophetic acts to infuriate the dominant powers. In doing so, Jesus reframes the holy and he reaffirms instead the sanctity of human life. The first act that he performs is a reframing of the temple. In John chapter 2, he kicks out the traders out of the temple. He reframes the temple in the sense that he does not dismiss the temple, but from the perspective of the religious leaders, he has desecrated the temple. But as we know in this chapter, by doing so, Jesus was bringing back the importance of the temple as the dwelling of God from the Old Testament, and he himself now is the new temple and the dwelling of God among us as human beings. The second act is the reframing of the nations and can be found in Jesus's encounter with the Samaritan woman. Through this encounter with the Samaritan woman, Jesus reframes the role and place of the nations, and the passage leads us to the realization that salvation has reached non-Jews. So the nations come back and take a core place in God's salvation plan through this act that also would have infuriated the dominant powers of his day. The third act of power is the reframing of the Sabbath. And Jesus did this in numerous times in the Gospels by performing miracles or doing other acts of compassion on the Sabbath day. By doing this, he's giving permission to his followers for once and for all to do good on the Sabbath day. And we hear back the statement that humans were humans were not created for the Sabbath, but Sabbath was created for human beings. The fourth prophetic act reframes our understandings of power and authority. In John chapter 7, we read this long polemic in 53 verses with the Jews. And the Jews here are several categories: his brothers, the Jewish leaders, and the public. All of them are infuriated. All of them are challenged. And as Jesus reframes our understanding of power and authority as having its source from God. And the fifth and final act that I want to mention is the all-important reframing of the Mosaic law. Jesus, in this chapter 8 of John's Gospel, as we know, forgives the woman caught in adultery. And he is reframing the Mosaic law, refocusing it on the source, which is God's compassion for humanity. He forgives the unforgivable. These acts of power divide the elite, and some will join and others will not join. The elite that follow will become core to the change movement. Those who don't will lead to the collapse of the old system. Application to the Lebanese context in closing. The principles from the Gospel of John that we have looked at have application for the Lebanese context. Let me give some examples. The 17 October change movement came at a critical time when the old political guard had attained a peak in demonstrating its total bankruptcy, though they continue to manifest themselves in unbelievable ways in Lebanon. But this does not mean that everyone was ready for change in 2019. Change was still sought by a minority. Many of those who initially came out with change slogans ended up returning to their vomit, to use Jesus' own words, and they voted again for their sectarian leaders and thieves. Once again, they had been given the choice: shall I give you Jesus, the change leader, or the murderer? And for a large majority, the answer came, Barabbas, the murderer. Secondly, change hails from the outside, from outside the political and social elites. It is often driven by despair, met by true compassion. But we know also that members of the political and social elite have to join the change movement for revolution to truly happen. And that is a phenomenon that has been observed in most revolutions of human history. And we see that in the gospel as well, with many in the early church who were from the elite, who were from the upper classes. But the majority of those who followed Jesus were those that he had met with true compassion and driven and drawn out of a state of despair. Thirdly, the change movement appeals to the marginalized when it succeeds in bringing them out of a narrative of victimhood and empowers them with a vision for new possibilities. So long as we remain in a state of victimhood, that we remember the past simply as us being victims and the others as the aggressors, it is impossible to come out and be empowered and to see the new possibilities. It is only through the healing of memories that we are able to acquire this vision for a new future. Fourthly, leaders of change should challenge the mentality of scarcity. They should cultivate a mentality of affluence through the sharing of resources, through a revisiting of the politics of economics. And this begins with gratitude in the heart that sees beyond the material, small material value that we have, or resources that we have. And finally, we need to ask ourselves, what are the holy symbols of the old that need to be reframed in Lebanon? We can think of the involvement of religious leaders in politics. That is a reality that is sacred in a country sectarian like Lebanon. Can we challenge the involvement of religious leaders in politics? Of course, that has applications in other settings as well, where this is a recurring phenomenon. Secondly, can we extend justice to refugees? Refugees are a very sensitive topic in my country, whether Palestinian or Syrian or Iraqis. And can we bring justice to the marginalized? In Lebanon, there is a whole category of people who are dealt with unjustly for years, the domestic workers who come from Asia and from sub-Saharan Africa. And finally, the belief that violence is the answer to everything. This is probably one of the most sacred symbols that can lead you to being accused of treason if you touch it. The idea that there should be no arms outside the hands of the state. The idea that violence is not the answer to all our problems in Lebanon. The conviction that violence is the answer is a highly problematic issue in Lebanon, but it is the answer neither to Lebanon's internal nor to its external problems. So we have reviewed some core components that make a change movement possible and successful. True leaders of change need to emerge that can demonstrate a moral high ground against the status quo. The church has a responsibility to nurture and cultivate such leaders. Until then, the Lebanese voter will continue to vote for Barabbas.